I've decided to make this following video for a few reasons. One, because this man's life is extraordinary, and two, because I just want to play this really good pun. So without any further ado, here's a video about Sir Isaac Newton, the man who knew tons of stuff. Now, Newton was born on Christmas of 1642 in a place in England called Lincolnshire. His father was also called Isaac Newton, although he died 3 months before Isaac Newton, Sir Isaac Newton, the one we know, was born. His mother left him when he was 3 years old, leaving him with his granny, and he would only reunite with his mother at the age of 12. And at that age was when he studied at King's School in Lincolnshire, where he was born, and was introduced to chemistry. Later, his mum would make him leave the school to start doing farming, although Newton hated it so much that his mum decided to bring him right back into school. And he continued his education and finished his education at King's School, and surprise, surprise, he was one of the top students there. Now, in 1661, his uncle persuaded him and his mother to enroll Newton into Trinity College in Cambridge University. But he was so poor that, a lot of the times he had to clean up after the richer students to make some sort of money. And that time, University of Cambridge was teaching a lot of philosophy and stuff to do with Aristotle and all those, old philosophers you might know the names of. Newton himself enjoyed reading about modern philosophers, or whatever was modern at, in the 1660s. He even had a separate set of notes for it called Questions Quaedam Philosophicae, or whatever how you pronounce it in Latin, which in English would just means certain philosophical questions you had about, philosophy and stuff. Well, in 1664, Newton was awarded a scholarship to study 4 more years at the University of Cambridge until he graduated, doctorate. But this success didn't really come easy, because it was also the same period where Cambridge and pretty much the rest of Europe got hit by a storm of the Great Plague at the time. And, Cambridge University had to close down, so Newton had to go home and kind of continue his own studies in his own house and free time and stuff. And it was during that time, during that 18-month period, where Newton started to do work on light, optics, planetary motions. It was also the time that people thought that an apple fell on Newton's head. But what certainly happened at that time was invention of a massive field of mathematics that we now know as calculus. Damn you, Great Plague. Well, eventually Newton impressed one of his mentors at university called Isaac Brown, and he kind of helped Newton to become more well known in the maths world. And eventually, when Newton did become a professor, he started to work on stuff with optics and light. In 1671, Newton demonstrated his own design reflecting microscope to the Royal Society. That following year, he would publish notes on light and optics, which impressed everyone. Well, almost everyone. You see, one of the guys who kind of disagreed with Newton and had critics on his work was a guy called Robert Hooke, who you might know as being the spring guy. Yes, it's the guy who came up with F equals kx, but we're not talking about him. And they eventually started arguing about, stuff from time to time, until the point where Newton just threatened to leave the Royal Society. Although some people there still had support for Newton and kind of asked him to stay. But it also wasn't just Robert Hooke. It was also another Dutch scientist with him called Christian Huygens, and several other people as well, who didn't agree with a certain point that Newton made. You see, Newton thought that light had particle characters, although many other scientists, including Hooke and Huygens, thought that light was more of a wave. And we know the rest of the story. Eventually, photoelectric effect came in, but before the photoelectric effect, obviously, was the Young's double slit experiment. And eventually, we came to kind of agree that light actually has a dual characteristic between particle and being wave. But that's not really what we're talking about right here, is it? I just went on tangent again. And then came 1679, which was a dark year for Newton because his mother died, and he would almost cut himself from the rest of the world because he absolutely just lost it, and he just did stuff by himself, which included a lot of studies on gravitation and planetary orbits. And he also even had chats with his archenemy Hooke, had a little chat, and he kind of realized that orbits, in like planetary orbits, the centripetal force is inversely proportional to the radius squared, which is kind of where Newton's force of gravitation kind of built up from. Of course, they didn't actually chat. It was more like mail because, 17th century, you don't have computers yet. And it also wasn't just him. There was also another guy called Edmund Halley, who I think has a comet named after him. He was also very interested in Newton's work on these planets, on planets' force, gravity, and stuff like that. He wanted Newton to keep doing research on it, to show that planet orbits in eclipses, which is what Newton believed in and kind of knew about maybe 18 years beforehand. Halley pretty much did everything to make sure Newton published a paper on this. He even offered to pay to get this research published. And yes, after 18 months of hard work, in 1687, Newton released the Principia. The Principia was said to be one of the most important books of all the history of physics. It included a lot of stuff with Newtonian and classical physics. It's kind of where all it started. It included his famous 3 laws of motion, which we have covered at least 1 million times on this channel, which turned out to not only apply for big planets, but pretty much everything else. Well, almost everything else until obviously Albert Einstein came along. And it was also talked a lot about masses of each planet, how it kind of shows that Earth is a bit flat at the poles. It mentioned a lot about gravity, and it also talked about how the sun affects the tide on the ocean on Earth. But of course, there's always going to be haters, isn't there? And again, Robert Hooke accused Newton of plagiarism on the inverse square law, which is related about the centripetal force with the radius between 2 planets. Although Hooke really never proved it mathematically, and Newton kind of won that one because he never proved it mathematically. But Newton did get so mad at Robert Hooke that in later editions of the Principia, he took out all references that he made to Robert Hooke. So Robert Hooke wasn't mentioned at all in the later editions of the Principia. And then Newton became even more famous. In 1689, he represented Cambridge, the city of Cambridge, in the Parliament. In 1693, though, he had his second big breakdown after he was appointed into a bigger position amongst the monarchs, and losing touch with one of his admirer, friend, student called Nicholas Faccio di Duia, who was Italian. Not long after that, though, he regained himself and he started to study a lot about alchemy. In 1703, after Hooke's death, Newton was instead appointed as the president of the Royal Society instead of him. And 2 years after that, Isaac Newton became Sir Isaac Newton, as he was knighted by the king. Actually, it was the queen at that time, though, but yeah. But then came another disagreement. Here came a man called Leibniz, who claimed that Newton copied his work about calculus, and investigations were done by the Royal Society. And nope, it concluded that Newton kind of came up with calculus first. But then that wasn't the only case that year, because another man called John Flamsteed also got mad at Newton for start using some of his collected data in some editions of Principia to quote a lot of data that Flamsteed got from investigating in the observatory. And what Newton tried to do was he tried to force these notes made by Flamsteed to be published out to the public, even though some of these weren't even kind of ready. It was not edited and stuff, although Flamsteed, with the court involved, managed to halt this process from preventing the documents to be released kind of before editing and stuff like that. Newton became very rich and famous all around Europe towards the end of his life. And at the age of 80, he had digestion problems. eventually hurting his abdomen so much he went unconscious. And on March 31st, 1727, Sir Isaac Newton died. It was a sad time for the community to see such a great man go. You know, people was comparing him with the great scientists that came before him, the great Greek philosophers and all those kind of guys. Of course, he made quite little friends. He had many enemies, broke down a couple of times. But one of the saddest bits about Newton's life, well, he died a virgin.